Hello, everybody, and today we're going to be taking a look at an interesting case for Is It Fascist? We're going to be taking a look at the Terran Federation from Starship Troopers. When a lot of people think about fascism in uh, fiction, they'll often what'll come to mind is either the book Starship Troopers or more probably the movie Starship Troopers. And with good reason. The aesthetics of it, the way society's structured, it gives a very fascist vibe to it. The uniforms look very fascist. You have the eagle, you have the jingoism, you have like the humanity first, you have a militaristic society. There's a lot of things about it that really do resemble it. Even once we get into the background a bit, a lot of it is kind of reminiscent of paramilitarism, of Mussolini's March on Rome, that sort of thing. And I even called it fascist in a old video I did called Libertarian Fascism. And the interesting thing about the Terran Federation, about Starship Troopers, is there's so many different ways that people look at it. People who like it as divergent as fascists, libertarians, conservatives, even some liberals and people on the left can look at this type of government and see some things that they admire about it. Now, the question is, and we'll go through our list, it looks like fascism, it talks like fascism, but is it really fascism? And I haven't done the count beforehand, but I think we might be surprised by where this winds up scoring. So that being said, we ask the question, is the Terran Federation from Starship Troopers fascist? We're going to be talking about the Terran Federation as kind of an amalgam of both the movie and the book. So how the Terran Federation came about is somewhat vague. From my understanding, and from what the book tells us, the late 20th century saw the collapse of society due to so-called unlimited democracies, which I'm assuming is like late liberal democracy or something like that. They also refer to the fraudulent Marxian definition of value from which communism derives, and civil unrest due to rule by a pre-scientific pseudo-professional class who called themselves social workers and child psychologists and who banned corporal punishment. So, more or less, and this is ironic coming from Heinlein, it just seems like society got very decadent and degenerate, and there was a war between the Russo-Anglo-American alliance against the Chinese hegemony, devastated large portions of the world, and kind of just throwing something else in there was a coup d'etat where intellectuals briefly took over and tried to create a utopia, and basically society more or less collapsed. And amidst the aftermath of this war, you had a lot of veterans who started to form their own groups, their own councils, and began restoring order in different areas. They would like hang the bandits, they would and began to restore order. These various groups and militias only allowed other veterans to serve in it. And it's not very specific, but over time, this ideology and this governmental system spread across the world, and they all eventually federated together in the Terran Federation, which is the government that controls both Earth and the various colonies. The Terran Federation functions as a limited franchise democracy, which is something we often don't see that much in fiction. More specifically, it functions as a limited franchise democracy that isn't based on race, class, religion, or wealth requirements. The only requirement to be able to vote in the Terran Federation is that you've completed federal service, which is generally speaking 2 years, although in a case of a national emergency, it can be extended, I think, indefinitely. It's either to 20 years or indefinitely. It depends a bit on the source material. And this comes out of the original premise for the Terran Federation that the entire leadership was only made up of military veterans. Now, the book says the idea was we're putting the sheepdogs in charge of the sheep, that the most important quality someone can have to rule a country is the willingness to put their lives in danger for the greater good. That is, if you're allowing veterans to vote, at the very least, you know that you have someone who's willing to put their life on the line for the good of the country and to have completed life and death federal service. And it's determined that that is the specific type of moral and spiritual integrity needed for someone to lead society. Also, it's a bit like almost kind of like 1984, where the idea is you're putting all the people who have power or would be have the will to power in charge. So there's not really an obvious place for a revolt to come from, since the military and the government are the same. But it's not exclusive, so theoretically, if anyone wanted to change the system, they could just complete their federal service and then run for office. So there's a lot of release valve. The actual society seems to be fairly libertarian in a lot of ways. Government spending doesn't appear to be that big a deal. Um, it's just there's citizens and civilians. The vast majority of the population are civilians. Citizens are only those who've completed federal service. There seem to be very, very few restrictions on people's lives. It just mostly seems to be a capitalist society led by this weird limited franchise military junta that's also kind of a democracy. Now, what federal service is depends a lot based on the source material. The impression that was given is that federal service was only done either in the military or something else dangerous. Um, Rico, our main character, winds up joining the mobile infantry. You can also serve in the fleet. They reference volunteering for medical experiments and other things like that. The idea is that anybody who's willing to commit to federal service, regardless of their disabilities or disadvantages, is able to perform federal service. Even if you were a quadriplegic, they would still find something for you to do. The only requirement is that a psychiatrist deems that you're able to understand the oath that you're going to take. Now, while it's often military service, I've seen in other kind of spin off medias that it just refers to any kind of civil service. So some of the people will work as relief workers, they'll work on like as labor for state projects. Maybe they'll do work in the civil service, but there's a wide variety of other jobs that people do other than just serving in the army, but that seems to be the most prestigious one. At the end of your 2 years, you gain citizenship, which I think only actually gives you the right to vote, the right to run for office, and free education, free post secondary education. I believe people who serve as long as 20 years get guaranteed employment for the rest of their lives. But generally speaking, it doesn't seem like the state really awards that many direct privileges aside from rulership itself to the people who choose to serve in the federal service. The other thing that's kind of interesting about it is in many ways kind of a liberal utopia aside from the militarism. It's completely multicultural. There's complete gender parity. There's no racism. Religion, I believe, still exists, but it's in a very like secular, all things are equal, very much a utopian society of freedom that, in a lot of ways, seems to lack any sort of central ideological component beyond capitalism. But that being said, let's just get into it and let's try to determine if the Terran Federation is in fact fascist. Number one, an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary or progressive ideas. Now, this is an interesting one because at first glance, people might say, "Oh, well, it's you got the militarism, you have a military is necessarily right winged. You have capitalism, you have all this other stuff, and that's mixed with like racial equality and gender equality and all this other stuff. So yeah, I guess it is a mixture. I'm going to argue that it really is not a reactionary or conservative society because if we look at what you would kind of parts of fascism normally describe a reactionary or conservative society, it's harkening back to the past, to racial pride, to cultural pride, to religious identity, to traditional gender roles, restoring an older form of government. It has something to do with the past and restoration of the traditional social order. The government of the Terran Federation is something, well, there's aspects of it from previous eras. It's something that's very kind of new and revolutionary and different, and it was built almost explicitly to reject the old world and to create something completely new in its place. So I would argue it is, broadly speaking, a progressive society, and it's not syncretic. It is, however, because it's militaristic and because it's not like pacifistic, it is able to sustain itself a lot better and to deal with a lot of the consequences. I assume they just kill criminals, for instance, with like death squads, than similar regimes are you'll see both in our world and in fiction. So for this one, I'm going to say no. Identitarianism with a clearly defined in group and out group, cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. Now, this one is very, very hard because, on one hand, you could say, yes, there's an in group and an out group, there's citizens and then there's civilians. But every other metric of their society, be it race, religion, even when it comes down to most types of civic privileges and freedoms, there isn't really a distinction between anybody based on any lines. You could also argue that there is a human supremacist aspect to it, as there's a belief that they have to defeat the bugs because only one sentient race could rule over the universe. But I don't know. I'm going to have to, and I'm sure people will disagree with me, give half a point here because citizenship is something literally anybody can have. Granted, the only limit on it is basically just service. It doesn't have anything that you would traditionally see in a fascist movement. Like if we were to look at something like the New Order from Star Wars, you have a lot of conservative elements to it. You have human high culture, you have strong emphasis on gender roles, an appeal to the elitism of the core worlds. You have stuff like that. Here, I just don't see anything. A revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. I mean, yeah, it might be a civic nationalism. It might be even a cultural nationalism. But patriotism and jingoism is an important part of the Terran Federation. They have their national myths that they treat with a religious like devotion. Their entire movement was founded basically similar to Mussolini's March on Rome or something by revanchist veterans who wanted to restore their society's glory, to restore their society's order. Now, their conception of what that order eventually became wasn't necessarily a conservative one or a syncretic one, but there is a very strong romantic nationalism and revanchism that's at the heart of it. You can also see that with the way the war propaganda goes against the bugs. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. That is an interesting one, and I might have to say I'm not really sure if we can say this one way or another. I guess there's no political parties, to my knowledge, within the Terran Federation. I mean, there might be. I guess you could argue in the sense that the only characteristic necessary to hold power is service to the state. It's just that it's weird because it's not socialistic or really fascistic in any other way. Like, you don't seem to have large government run enterprises or extensive censorship or other kind of restrictions you'd see in an authoritarian government. I'm going to say, though, we're going to give it a point here, although I think it's kind of hard. It might just be that we don't see enough of what the actual society functions like. It is clear that there is a supremacy of the state, but the state does not appear to be particularly large. A conception of of an idealized new man. I mean, it gets the point here. That's what this entire thing was about. Was about communism failed, liberal democracy failed, the technocrats failed, the scientists failed, the people who were psychiatrists failed. What we needed was a new man, a man of action, a man who was willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of others, who was willing to put their lives on the line to serve the nation and to serve the state. And that's more or less the entire premise of it, and that's what's taught in was it moral philosophy within the school system. Is this conception of a new man, and that by serving in the army you become the new man who's eligible to vote. A foreign policy that places national self-interest above ideology or morality. I would say one of the issues we have when we're dealing with situations like this is you have a hegemonic society that has conquered all of Earth and all of the various human colonies. Now, I think in some of them there's some secessionist movements. In the novel, they reference some spin-offs of humanity who have sided with the bugs. But generally speaking, it just seems that the foreign policy purposes of the Terran Federation is the survival and expansion of the Terran Federation, and there doesn't appear to be any particularly strong ideological motivation behind it beyond kind of an abstract human nationalism. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. Once again, this is an interesting case because normally in a fascist society, what this refers to is the people don't care about economics. They believe in the supremacy of spirit. And so they favor a centralized state run economy within an authoritarian society because they believe that the will to power, the strength of the state, the strength of the party is able through cooperation and force of will, for lack of, sorry to reuse the term again, to be able to just kind of force itself through to overcome whatever the material limitations are. And then, so long as men of proper moral character are using the resources for the good of the nation, it can function. This kind of takes in the other direction where economics is not a particular concern of the government, as far as I can tell. A lot of people said it even kind of seems like Ancapistan, that it's kind of a libertarian economic system. There's not really much talk about government regulation. I don't know how much infrastructure there is. It almost seems kind of like a night watchman state where the military maintains law and order, safety and security, and stuff like that. But everything else is mostly kind of left up to the citizens. Also, the citizens don't vote themselves a bunch of economic privileges other than tuition, which isn't really that big a thing. Once they become, they've come to power. So it's weirdly enough kind of an indifference to economics, but in another direction. So I'm going to give it a point here. I hope I'm making sense. A masculine approach to problem solving focusing on decisive action. I'm going to have to say yes. Once again, the entire point of this was that democracy was weak, liberals were weak, communists were weak. We need men of action. We need military veterans. We need people who are willing to fight for the greater good to lead our society. So it gets a full point here. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. This one is really hard because civilians are encouraged to become citizens and to participate in the process, but it's not a necessity. It doesn't really seem like much is expected aside from paying taxes and obeying the law among normal citizens. There aren't really political parties or any large associations other than the state who are trying to get people to participate, to make active displays of patriotism and nationalism and stuff like that. So I'm going to have to give it, I think I'll give it half a point here because there is a encouragement of everyone to partake federal service and become part of the citizenry, but there's not really a political party, and there isn't a high expectation on individual participation that you'll have in a lot of other totalitarian states. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite intergroup to safeguard the new order. I mean, once again, that's what this entire thing was based on, was that you would have a new order that would come about who would be able to make up for past failings and that we take democracy out of the hands of everybody and we put it into the hands of the few, the qualified people, those who are able to sustain the revolution. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. To the best of my knowledge, this isn't the case. The couple examples we have of the Supreme Sky Marshal or whatever, and don't appear to be that high profile. It appears to be very much an oligarchy where there isn't really a charismatic leader. Maybe in some of the Starship Troopers sequel films, Rico becomes head of the Federation and centralizes power, but it really doesn't seem like there's any form of this to speak of. Sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. Once again, it kind of depends. The ruling class does this, but it's not expected of the average person. I don't think conscription exists in this world, for instance. Or, once again, any real need for the average person to fully go into it. It doesn't appear that there's like a strong secret police force, that there's widespread confiscation of property, that there's other things like that that would kind of necessitate this. So I'm going to give this a half a point because it's kind of true. So let's add up and see where we are. This gets a. Okay, so adding it all up, we get 8.5 points, which puts it squarely in the para-fascist category, which I think is appropriate. Well, in a lot of ways, when it comes to Vanguardism, a non democratic state, the focus on pride, moral values over economic concerns, I don't think it goes on to full on fascism just because it lacks that reactionary element to it. Well, you could argue that maybe it being militaristic or it coming from people who fought for the old world or military tradition might put it into that category. I don't think so. If there was some sort of religious or ethnic or cultural connotation to the Terran Federation, say it was formed around the nucleus of America or China or something like that, or even if it had a monarch, I might be more willing to put it into that category. But lacking any real sense of identitarianism beyond just a purely civic one, I can't really see a way to put it into the full-on fascist category, placing it squarely in the middle of para-fascist with 8.5 points. Now, once again, as always with these, I didn't plan this out ahead of time, but I think that this makes a lot of sense. This is unironically probably the closest thing that you're going to get to civic fascism, or kind of late stage civic nationalism. One thing I will give the Terran Federation Heinlein a lot of credit for is he did come up with a completely innovative and different governmental system, but one that you could kind of see working. I mean, we had some examples of this throughout history with Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, in which citizenship was confined to a small percentage of the population, or maybe not a small percentage, but some of the population. And some sort of service to the state or wealth requirement was necessary in order to participate. The idea being that only people who had a stake in it, either shown through service or as they were descended from a citizen or something like that, would be able to participate within it. It's just, perhaps it's because it's science fiction or that sort of thing, but I can't think of an example that's so divorced from any specifics, any particulars, as it were, any particular culture, any particular country, history, religion, anything like that. If we just had a little bit more to go on from the conservative side, this might be one of the most clear examples of fascism we've ever seen, albeit an unconventional one, and one that leans a lot more on the, I guess, some of the core characteristics versus kind of the external. It's weird because it has some external signs in terms of the aesthetics, but a lot of the things you'd expect to see, like heavy censorship and secret police and the state-run economy, just doesn't really seem to be there that much. But then again, we don't see a ton about civilian life. So I could be wrong. This is just going off of what I remember, what I was able to read on the wiki. So I hope you found that video interesting. More Is It Fascist to come. God bless everybody, and I'll talk to you all real soon.